Welcome to Friday night's video in our Master Series. This is the 52nd video in our Master Series, the 22nd video in our first phase processing, and our first video on equalization. So, first of all, when we get into equalization, you'll kind of have to excuse me because I might ramble here a little bit. This actual equalization process is not that complicated. The issue that I've seen with most people is they don't understand what they're trying to do when they equalize a track or equalize a mix, because the concept is that we'll get into equalizing a mix later, but for right now we're trying to equalize a track. So that's a separate concept in itself because of trying to equalize things so they mix well together, which sometimes can mean going back to the individual tracks and re-equalizing them so that they complement the mix better. But basically, that we're going to talk about a couple things. The first thing that I want to talk about is this is a huge problem for a lot of people that I've seen trying to understand signal processing and equalization, is that this is a first stage equalization after you've done sound sculpting, which we'll revisit in a minute. But when you get done equalizing this track, you are going to try to get this track to sound as good as possible all by itself. Now, this can change when you go into subgroup processing or group processing. And I'll explain this so that in any one of these processes that you might revisit any of them, and equalization is a huge one because it's one of the biggest tools you have to really make those good captures that you've edited well come out sounding great. So let's take for example, I go to subgroup processing. I've got two guitars. One of them, they're playing the same exact part, but I lined in one of them and I recorded the microphone, the other one, but they're playing the same part. Now I've panned one of them right and one of them left, and I'm going to want to equalize them a little differently so that they have their own character. This concept is that they're in the same frequency range and even playing the same thing, but I want them to sound a little different. Not only did I mic them, one of them I mic'd and one of them I line input them, because that's going to definitely cause it to sound a little bit different. But also I'm going to equalize them a little differently. The one on the left, I'm going to let it have a little more low end. Whereas the one on the right, I'm going to cut some of the low end out and give us a little bit of boost in higher end. This adds body to the mix because it makes it sound like there's more going on than there actually is. And once you get those tracks equalized individually to where they sound as good as possible by themselves, you might revisit that and do some low cut on one and do some low boost on the other one in a simple concept like that, maybe some high boost or high cut on one of them or things like that. You might do a little bit of equalization work on them in the next step of subgroup processing to make them, that subgroup, have, sound better together. And you've got those two guitars and they sound awesome together because by themselves now they may not sound as good, but together they complement each other and fill out that spectrum. One of them, just a simple example, has a little more low end than the other one. The other one has more high end, but they still fill in that spectral content that you need for that guitar. But by themselves, they might not sound as good. It's a huge lesson. And it's something that's just always a work in progress, that you're going to revisit it to make those things work better together. And also when you get into the mix, let's say I've got that subgroup of those guitars or just one guitar. And I've got the guitar and I've finished that track and it sounds awesome, bro. I mean, the equalization work I did on it just sounds smooth as silk, and it's just, yeah. All right. But when I get into the mix, and all of a sudden I start trying to see how it sounds with the rest of the mix, that it doesn't sound as good. So I start trying to equalize that individual track to make it sound more complementary to the rest of the instruments. And I find that I'm going to boost the high end a little bit, or boost the low end a little bit, or I'm going to do something to it that makes it stand out a little bit better so that it's got its own presence in the mix. And its presence, I might by itself, it sounds like it's a little bit too much in the high mid range all by itself because I boosted in that area. But it's really complementing the other instruments in the mix because they're filling out other frequency ranges. So together they have this really cool smooth sound that really works well together, which can be a problem because sometimes you might even find yourself re-EQing for different sections of a song. It's like in this section you've got these set instruments, and so you've re-EQ'd things a little bit so they complement each other. And then in the next section, in the chorus, that you've got a different instrument complement. And there's different instruments. Movie scores can be really problematic with that you start rethinking your EQ or any processing you've done so that they all, complement each other as well as possible. That is a work in progress, and it's something I really want you to think about so you can really understand that concept so that you don't get frustrated. I see people fussing with a lot of stuff in audio engineering, and they think, well, they just do that or that or that, and then they're done. But these things don't really sink in so that they don't get frustrated and mad that their stuff just never sounds good, and then why I did that, and then now it doesn't sound good, and why is that, and da 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 da. If you understand that concept, that can be with anything. As you go through a project, that you adjust things so that it complements each other. It's just like a baseball team or a football team, or that might not be a great example, but it's the whole thing has to work together so it sounds really good. And sometimes that the individual track may not be needs to be not so as good sounding by itself, and so that it doesn't take up other space of other instruments or conflict with other instruments. And that is a huge lesson that you just learn from experimentation. It's like people get fighting with the kick drum and the bass, they're trying to fight for their own space, and simple things of EQing them a little bit differently and things like that can give them their own space, even if they're riding in the same spectrum. Just like those two guitars are playing in the same frequency range, but I've EQ'd them a little bit differently so they don't conflict with each other, so they have their own space even though they're in the same range. Does that make sense? And being able to do that tastefully without one of them sounding horrible. So that's an experimentation in progress that you just have to work on, slight changes and things like that once you start mixing so that they complement each other so the mix sounds better. Sometimes is something you have to do. So really think about that concept, get it in your head that it can be is part of the process, and so that you remember that and make some notes about that. So as you're going through the process, that you do a good job and you don't get frustrated because you run into that. So other than that, let's take a look at actual equalization issues. The first thing we come to is I want to talk about actual equalization at this phase. Now, you have to understand that every instrument has its own range. Does that make sense? So you kind of want to EQ it into its own range. High pass, low pass, filter it into its own range, beside maybe EQing it a little bit differently later on when you start mixing them together, so that any conflicting frequencies of things that are going to be overlaid on overlapping on top of each other don't start conflicting with each other and making a muddy sound or them getting lost in the mix. That's a huge concept. You've got a vocal is another thing, is that, when you're EQing the vocal, that when you look at a vocal, it's going to be, let's say it's something like this, it's going to be moving around. So it has this envelope, but it's not static at 500 hertz. The main frequency isn't static 500 hertz. It's going to be moving around some. Does that make sense? That envelope of sound. So this would be like the envelope of sound, and that's going to be moving up and down and changing some as the individual sings differently because of the transducer that the mouth is changing a little bit. The vocal is a very complicated thing to mix, and it's a very complicated subject because it is so complicated. The transducer, it is your voice, is very complex. So keeping in mind that that's moving around. So with that in mind, that the biggest thing you're going to run into, and some of the biggest problem I've seen people run into, is that in this stage, we're trying to equalize the sound over the spectrum. So that means, that doesn't necessarily mean equalizing that individual thing as far as its frequency content, because the equal loudness contour, most people do not really completely understand the concept that no matter what instrument I'm working with, that later on when it start getting mixed together, that it should be taken into consideration. There is a problem when you start trying to take it into consideration too much when you're dealing with things like synth patches, because you may have equalized that thing, and that might be part of the actual patch, that if you start changing the equalization too much, that it's not going to have the same effect or sound the same, and that can be a problem. So synthetic sounds, be real careful with when you're equalizing, take it into consideration, but if it starts changing the sound too much, get out of that and start equalizing it until you just get it where it sounds good, so you'll be skipping one step in the process. It's very simple that, you take up, most of the time I will equalize, when I'm considering the equal loudness contour, I'm considering this one. So I know around 500 hertz here, and up to about 1,000 hertz, then it levels out, and then it starts rising up. So anything down here has to start getting raised at those kind of levels. And between 1,000 and 2,000 hertz here, that it's going to get boosted some. Between 2 and 5 or something like that, that it's going to be getting subtracted some along those lines. And between 5 and 10, that it's going to be getting boosted, and then it's going to fall off there. Now, the understanding of this is because if you set up your EQ or it's doing that to a sound, your ears perceive that they're at the same decibel level as this here. Does that make sense? And it's a real simple concept. The problem is it may not work really well in some instances. Sometimes I'll be going along doing that, and I'll be going, no, I need to boost that only that much. I need to drop that down maybe a little more. I need to drop that down a bit, and I actually need to boost this up a little bit for the specific sound. It sounds much better to my ears that way, because it's pushing content of that sound that I like into levels that are sound good to me. So that is a work in progress, but you begin attenuating and boosting in these areas first, and I'll explain that. And you've got different, this is the equal loudness contours, the Robertson-Dadson contours, and the Fletcher-Munson curve here, and the contrast as this is improved over time. I have an EQ that actually has that set up on it at different stages, and I will show you that. So basically, let's talk about the first thing before we're going to go into EQ in the next video. So what we're going to do is in the next video, I want you to understand we want to work with a parametric EQ, so understand that, and I'll explain to you why that you want to work with that, because you can do a much better job in your equalization. We're going to talk about the difference between the sound sculpting we did and the equalization are two different things, and why that is. So take that stuff into consideration, make some notes about that, and in the next video we're going to actually pull out some EQs and look at some different EQs, and we are going to pull out a parametric EQ, and we're going to go through the process. I normally make it a 4-stage process to do a good job on equalization, and I'll explain to you why. And hopefully by the time we get done doing this, that you don't get frustrated so much. You have a really good idea of what you're trying to do when you pull out an EQ, so that you're able to have an informed understanding of what the heck you're trying to do and some informed steps so that you can do a better job from at least a semi-educated standpoint, so that you're actually able to do some good equalization work, which is one of the biggest steps in your first phase processing and in some of the other steps when we're processing the whole mix and subgroups. So peace, hope, love. I hope you enjoyed this first video on equalization or introduction, and in the next video we will talk about some other equalizers, why we want to use parametric EQ, and do some actual equalization and the steps that I think are necessary for you to do a good job and understand why that's what you need to do a good job. See you in the next video.